We're going to be speaking about gluten intolerance, which is something that I've made a presentation about before, but we're going to go into a bit more detail about specifically how to determine gluten intolerance via lab testing or self-testing. So that is kind of the center of the presentation. And then there'll be a short Q&A afterwards. From now on, we're doing longer webinars as part of the Phoenix Learn Monthly program. So these Thursday webinars are going to be a bit shorter. So just to recap from the last presentation, to talk about what's known as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So many of you might be familiar with celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition where people react to a certain protein in wheat. So non-celiac gluten sensitivity does exist, and it's actually a lot more common than people might think. So 1 in 10 people actually suffer from non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And some of the symptoms can be digestive, but actually the majority of people who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity experience non-digestive symptoms. And this can be problematic because it means that the condition can go unaddressed for a really long time. And often, especially in the kind of mainstream Western medicine sphere, if you go to see a physician and you complain of, gut irritation, they might do a celiac test or even a food sensitivity test. But, the less known digestive symptoms such as anemia, fatigue, brain fog, headaches, eczema, dermatitis, and depression and anxiety might not necessarily be associated with gluten sensitivity. So it's important to still keep that in mind and not just think that, oh, if I eat gluten and I'm not bloated and I don't have gastric distress, then I'm fine, because this can manifest in other ways. And, chronic conditions that result from long-term untreated non-celiac gluten sensitivity are things like epilepsy, ADHD, schizophrenia, diabetes, osteoporosis, MS, Hashimoto's, peripheral neuropathy. So there are many conditions that can result of if you leave this untreated. And the reason why, we're talking about this in the context of long COVID is that, long COVID can be characterized for some people, for everyone by, immune system dysfunction, but also damage the intestinal lining. So often, these symptoms, as I listed before, are actually quite common to long COVID, as well as common to non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So, of course, if you experience these symptoms before, they can be exacerbated, and you could also be more susceptible after having long COVID to experience these kind of symptoms. I'm sorry, the church bells are actually really loud. The church bells near my house, because the window's open, so hopefully it's not too distracting. So, one thing that people are sometimes kind of surprised about, or maybe confused about, is how non-celiac gluten sensitivity is kind of dismissed in the mainstream media. So here are some examples of articles, saying the science, why gluten sensitivity is probably fake. This one, science says gluten sensitivity isn't always real. Some people are just whiners. Here's another one, gluten intolerance may be completely fake. I think this is on BuzzFeed. So there are kind of quite a few reasons why this is the case. I think that one reason is due to inadequate testing, which we're going to talk about later. People are just tested for celiac. You don't have celiac, so you don't have an issue with gluten. And then this idea of tolerance is kind of not real or not scientific, which is not true, as we'll go into later. And another thing is just that gluten is really, things like pasta, bread, pastries, they're so much a part of a lot of traditional foods everywhere in the world, actually. Flatbreads, pizza, all of these different things are really, they're kind of embedded into culture and into food culture. And I think that people find it really hard to let go of the idea that this might not actually be serving them. Um, and then, of course, there's the fact that most processed food and fast food contains gluten. Um, so if you decide, oh, I want to cut out gluten, and you're someone who doesn't center their diet around whole foods, you kind of realize that you're eliminating maybe the majority of foods that you eat, which can be quite difficult to kind of address and overcome. um, this is quite a sciencey, a science kind of technical aspect of this concept of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but it's important to kind of understand this to understand why it's different to celiac disease. So wheat contains several different classes of proteins. Gliadins and glutenins are the two main components of the gluten fraction, so the gluten seed. Within the gliadin class, there's 4 different epitopes. So alpha, beta, gamma, omega. And wheat also contains agglutins, so proteins that bind to sugar, and protomorphins, which are proteins involved with cellular communication. So once wheat is consumed, the enzymes in the digestive tract basically break down the wheat compound, and in this process, additional proteins are formed. So celiac is characterized by an immune response to a specific epitope of gliadin. So basically, a specific class of protein, alpha gliadin, and a specific type of enzyme. So enzymes, once the wheat is consumed, enzymes are break down the wheat compound. So a specific type of protein and a specific type of enzyme are what gluten intolerance or what celiac disease are characterized by. However, there are other types of proteins and other types of enzymes that people also react to. And this is why non-celiac gluten sensitivity goes really undiagnosed um, because of these different types of proteins and different types of enzymes that are not tested for. So I'm going to show you an image of, let's scroll forward in the presentation. So here you can see the different types of proteins and the different types of enzymes. So at the top, you're going to see the different proteins, and at the bottom, you can see the different enzymes. And it's just the gliadin and the transglutamase 2 which are associated with celiac. And if you have some kind of reaction to any of the others, you're going to come out negative in a celiac test. So here is an example of what a test might look like. This is an example of the Cyrex Lab Array 3. It seems to be not very clear. I'm not sure if it's clear on your screen. But in this Array 3 test, you can see that the person would be diagnosed as not having celiac. However, they still have a reaction to certain types of protein and certain types of enzyme. And these gliadin transglutamase complex would suggest in this test that the patients experience an autoimmune reaction to wheat. And transglutamase 3, which is expressed primarily in the skin and lesser extent in the brain and placenta. So this person might be someone who experiences things like dermatitis or eczema when they eat gluten, but not necessarily, they might not necessarily experience digestive distress, but it manifests in their skin. And transglutamase 6, which is expressed in the brain and nervous system. So again, this person could maybe experience brain fog, some neurological issues with gluten, but not necessarily the digestive issues. So this is why it's quite important to be able to determine if this is something that you're experiencing. So another way, the test that I showed you is basically the Cyrex Lab Array 3. And that's one way that you can determine if you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But you can also just determine, and this way is as good as doing um, the lab test, if not better, is just an elimination diet. So if you remove all gluten-containing foods for 60 days, and at the end of the 60-day period, you cook up a big bowl of barley and then eat it, and then observe symptoms. Observe, you know, the digestive symptoms, the brain fog symptoms, the joint pain, the eczema, any of the symptoms that you're getting. Observe if they come up, and a few days later, eat a piece of wheat bread. And the reason why it's important to try barley first is because barley contains gluten, but it's also low FODMAP. So if you react to it, it suggests that you're intolerant to gluten or other gluten-like compounds. And if you don't react to the barley but react to the wheat bread, this would suggest you're intolerant to something specifically in wheat. So this is just a good way of kind of delineating the different things that you could be inflamed by, whether it's the gluten, whether it's the wheat, is it the FODMAPs, is it is it a FODMAP related thing, or is it a gluten related thing, or is it a wheat related thing? Because these are all slightly different. So just to clarify what FODMAPs are, so basically, FODMAP are, so when you go on a low FODMAP diet, you're basically eliminating specific sugars that trigger people with irritable bowel and sometimes with SIBO. So FODMAP stands for fermentable polysaccharides, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. So basically, these are short chain carbohydrates in the intestine that the small intestine absorbs poorly, and this leads to this IBS and SIBO type symptoms. So you can see cramping, diarrhea, constipation. So by doing this test with the barley, the elimination test with the barley, you're actually able to tell if it's FODMAPs that you have an issue with, or if it's actually the gluten that you have an issue with. And if you feel like it's actually the FODMAPs and you're reacting to the bread, for example, the wheat in the bread as opposed to the gluten that's mainly in barley, then you can do an elimination diet, a low FODMAP elimination diet. So you follow the same trajectory. You eliminate the foods for 2 months. And then afterwards, you do a reintroduction of more high FODMAP foods to see what the reaction is. And even though, these might sound less sophisticated, let's say, than the lab testing, it's actually, this is really the gold standard for food sensitivity, because this way you can actually see how your body is reacting, and you can know what your specific symptoms are. And it's always better to learn, be empowered and learn about the processes of your own body. And, the labs might be able to just kind of verify and back that up. But this is, a perfectly good way to do it otherwise. So I think that is it for the presentation. Let's see if we have any questions on non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Can a person with celiac disease eat pasta made with semolina? So no, semolina is basically semolina is made from tiny little balls of wheat flour that are kind of it's just miniature balls of flour and water, and that's what semolina is. So it's not gluten-free. So the gluten-free grains would be things like millet, sorghum, rice, corn. What else? What other oats are gluten-free. Things like sweet potato and cassava flour are gluten-free. all the nut flours. But in terms of grains, it's mainly the ancient grains like millet, sorghum, and rice. So if you would like to try gluten-free products, you can focus on that. The semolina is not. Can someone have both a wheat allergy and celiac disease at the same time? Yes, you can, because I mean, so the thing about autoimmune conditions is that they're often um, they often come hand in hand with other types of conditions. So it could be, people with celiac and even non-celiac gluten sensitivity more likely have candida, more likely have SIBO, more likely have all of these other types of gut issues, because often one thing leads to another. If we have some kind of issue in our gut, usually that will cause other kinds of imbalances and make our gut a kind of a breeding ground for other bacteria and yeast to live there. Um, if my stomach hurts right after I have milk or something with gluten, does that mean I'm lactose intolerant and gluten intolerant? Um, So actually, people who have lactose intolerance are lactose and gluten intolerance. Often, people who have those intolerances, they come hand in hand also, along with some other things. Because often, if you have a reaction to one type of protein, let's say in gluten, you'll also have a reaction to, let's say, casein, which is the protein in milk. So that's actually quite common, although they are separate things. So lactose intolerance can be characterized either by this genetic predisposition. So genetically speaking, we all have this mutation that allows us to produce the lactase enzyme, which allows us to digest lactose. And some people, just genetically speaking, don't have this mutation, and then they'll be just lactose intolerant for life, and there's no real way to change that. Other people will have, let's say, one parent who has the mutation and one person who doesn't, and then they'll have kind of a diminished ability to digest lactose. Or you can even, even if both or one of your parents has the mutation, you'll have some ability to digest lactose, but sometimes that can then be weakened by other things that damage the gut lining. So let's say pesticides, use of pharmaceutical drugs, unfiltered tap water, things like stress, other types of infections, candida, H. pylori, parasites, anything that kind of disrupts the gut lining can kind of exacerbate, make you lactose intolerant, essentially. So yeah, it's important to kind of differentiate that induced lactose intolerance from just the genetic predisposition to not be able to digest lactose, which is really, yeah, I mean, this is a more black and white thing. But often people have both hand in hand. So that is common, and often actually, if you're able to heal one, you're often able to heal the other. So let's say you have lactose intolerance because of poor gut health, and then you manage to eliminate your candida and feed your gut with healthy bacteria, fermented foods. You manage to get off, let's say, PPIs, things like omeprazole, and these protein pump inhibitors are really, really disruptive and bad for gut health. So if you're able to get those through the use of, if you're doing a weaning protocol, and you can soothe your gut with things like slippery elm, and you're able to basically digest your food better, get rid of parasites, H. pylori, filtering tap water, eating organic vegetables so you're not exposed to pesticides in the gut, reducing the consumption of pharmaceuticals like birth control pills or like painkillers. All of these things will help to support the gut health, and then you might be able to digest lactose better, and then also be able to digest gluten better. And often people can just completely recover from these intolerances. So I think that's it. Um, Thank you, everyone. for listening. And as I said, yeah, we're going to be doing these shorter presentations on Thursdays, and the longer presentations will be part of the Phoenix Learn program. And if you would like to find out about the Phoenix Learn, which is the Learn Monthly program, or the Phoenix Protocol, which is the same program but with a coach. So on Fridays, I host a coaching call and a Q&A, and have email follow-ups with the people who are on the call. So if you'd like to find out about that, you can scan the QR code. And thanks a lot for listening, and see you next week.